artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 220. We are talking about international governance of AI again today, because this is a field that is just growing and growing as we see governments across the globe start to grapple with the seemingly intractable idea of regulating something they don't understand. Helping them understand that is my guest, Markus Anderljung, who is Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for the Governance of AI in the UK. He aims to produce rigorous recommendations for governments and AI companies. His research focuses on frontier AI regulation, responsible cutting-edge development, national security implications of AI, and compute governance. He is an adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security and a member of the OECD AI Policy Observatory's expert group on AI futures. He was previously seconded to the UK Cabinet Office as a senior policy specialist. I know governance sounds really dry and a million miles away from the drama of existential threats and jobs going away and loss of privacy on a global scale. But governance is exactly the mechanism by which we can hope to do something about all of those things. Whenever you say, or you hear someone say, someone ought to do something about that, governance is what answers that call. We're going to talk about just what the Centre is, what it does, and how it does it, and definitions of artificial general intelligence insofar as they affect governance. Just what is the difference between training a system with 10 to the 25th and 10 to the 26th flops, for instance? And also in this part, Markus will talk about how monitoring and verification might specifically work. So let's get right into the interview. Markus Anderljung, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. And I want to talk to you about the Center for the Governance of AI, often abbreviated to GovAI here, because I'm fascinated by organizations that are tackling such an enormously vague, at times, and existential problem, and really want to know, well, everything about GovAI. How did it start? Who started it? And what are you trying to do?
Great. Yeah, really, really good to see you, Peter. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so GovAI, broadly, what we're trying to do is, one way to put it is sort of help humanity navigate some kind of transition into a world with sort of advanced AI systems. So something along the lines of AI systems that can do most tasks that sort of humans can do today. Unclear when that will happen, but at some point, I expect that we'll sort of edge toward that. Another way to sort of put it is, so we try to understand the impacts of systems like GPT-4, 5, 6, 7, etc., what the impact on the world might be, and then what governments and companies should be doing in light of that. Initially, we had a lot of our focus, so we were founded about 6 or so years ago, and we tried to focus. Initially, we focused a lot on sort of big picture questions. I guess one way to put it is sort of getting a better sense of the landscape. So trying to sort of found a field of people thinking about, okay, what are the kinds of things that we'll need to do as a society, that governments will need to do, et cetera, to deal with the impact of increasingly advanced AI. And then, for example, doing surveys on what do AI researchers think about when we will have what AI capabilities. And then over time, in particular, in the last 2 years or so, we've moved a lot more towards trying to make our research as action relevant as we can manage, while also being really quite rigorous to help sort of the decision makers sort of make some of these tricky decisions that they're currently trying to make.
I'm always curious about how an organization like this comes into being, not emerging fully fledged from the forehead of Zeus. It's got to have some kind of origin story with people behind it. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I think we'd have to go all the way back to 2016 when AlphaGo beat the sort of best Go player in the world. And that sort of lit a fire under and sort of activated the sort of founder of GovAI, was Alan Dafoe, who at the time was an IR professor over at Yale. He'd focused a lot on the causes of war and questions like what's the role of sort of technology and sort of geopolitical competition and these kinds of questions. And then he just decided, he was a tenured professor, and at this point decided, okay, I think probably I should really work on these AI questions. He started to try to do that at Yale. And then over time, he thought that, no, I need to sort of do something more ambitious and build something. And then he ended up setting up the GovAI as part of the University of Oxford. This was, I think, in 2018. And then we sort of started to try to build this organization around that time as well. He wrote this research agenda for the field of AI governance. And then I joined around, in 2018 as well. And then over time, we expanded this organization. About 2 or 3 years ago, we ended up leaving the university. This is partly because Alan was, at that point, got an offer to work for Google DeepMind to set up a new team there called the Strategy and Governance team to sort of really think about what might the impact be if DeepMind succeeds at their mission, which is roughly create machines that can do basically anything that a human can do. And what DeepMind and the world broadly need to do to sort of prepare if that eventuality comes to pass. And at that point, GovAI, we ended up spinning out of the university, which in retrospect, I feel really quite happy about because it means that we've been able to move a lot quicker and we've been able to hire people and sort of not have as much sort of bureaucratic hurdles that we otherwise would, and also be able to sort of have this quite a sort of interdisciplinary focus. We're sort of able to just hire people who we think just can do good work, no matter what their background is academically. Yeah, we don't need to have requirements about people having PhDs, even degrees at all, so long as we're confident that they can do research that we think is high quality.
Well, it's very interesting because we were recently talking about the news of the Future of Humanity Institute winding down, and that University of Oxford, their home, had decided to part company with them. Were you and FHI ever intersecting in any degree?
Yeah. So GovAI was a part of the Future of Humanity Institute. And then before FHI sort of shut down, we spun out a couple of years ago.
And what is the sort of geographical extent of GovAI's work and makeup? Do you tilt towards a particular country, a region, or are you as international as they come?
Yeah, maybe we're as international as they come. I'm a little bit unsure. So we have staff. We're sort of geographically mainly based in Oxford, still Oxford, UK. That's where sort of the majority of our staff is, but also partly just because of COVID, we ended up sort of hiring people who were based all over the world. So we also have a decent number of people in Berlin and in Canada and in the US as well. And I'm personally based in London. In terms of the focus of our work, jurisdictionally, mostly we've been focused on the US and the UK and the EU. And then compared to other organizations, I think we're a little bit more, we focus on lots of different jurisdictions at the same time, partly because, at least the way that I see it, is a decent amount of our value is we try to do this quite in-depth research on questions like, to what extent does a system like ChatGPT and whatnot require some kind of regulatory intervention? And that question actually can be quite applicable to different jurisdictions. And so often we have some kind of core of some kind of insight or some kind of research that we've done, and then we try to help apply that to different jurisdictions.
And when you talked about hiring people there, and because you mentioned earlier that separating from the university meant you weren't so tightly coupled to PhDs, and knowing that places like the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Center for the Future of Intelligence explicitly conduct PhD-level research on those topics, what do the job descriptions in those hiring notices look like?
So our hiring rounds?
Yes.
I don't know if I remember the actual things that we write down there, but in the actual job descriptions and whatnot. But oftentimes what we end up looking for is, it's a couple of things, but maybe the most important thing is, do we think that this person would be able to produce research that we think would be both high quality and be impactful? And so you can unpack that into a few different pieces. One piece is just, do we think that this person would, ideally somewhat independently, but less so over time, be able to identify research projects that we think could be really quite impactful, and that they have sort of a sense of questions that both seem really quite important, and also questions that sort of we expect policymakers will sort of face in the future. And so that's one thing that we end up looking for a decent amount. And then sort of, do we think that this person has produced research that we think is high quality in the sense of sort of having high rigor? And when someone reads it, they can actually really quite get a sense of, this is what the real uncertainties are here, and sort of not overstating things. And so there's a lot of those sort of epistemic virtues that we're looking for. And then I guess all this normal stuff of Is this a good person to work with? Are they going to sort of work hard, and are they going to be useful and exciting to have around? And then over time, we're also looking more and more for people who are sort of have some kind of sense of how policy processes work, in particular with sort of governments, to help make sure that our research is sort of as valuable as possible to sort of the decision makers there.
So is there a mandate or a mission here that exceeds the boundaries of what we would call research? If you were purely part of a university, then we'd say, well, your job is to study and produce research papers, but not to do anything else. But you are at the same time saying that you are looking for researchers, you are also saying that your mission is to make some kind of a difference here. So can you elucidate on the gap there?
Yes, I think usually the way that we'll sort of put it to our own staff, and sort of the way that we'll sort of try to talk about it internally, is just the job of the organization, or the thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to just do this thing that I said at the top. So I guess one way to put it is sort of, trying to help humanity navigate a transition to a world of advanced or transformative AI. And so the core asset that I think we have is just the research. So it is us trying to think really, really quite hard about some of these tricky questions. And then on top of that, we build other things. And so on top of that sort of core asset, one thing that we try to do is our mission on our website says that we are building a community of people who help manage the transition to more a world of advanced AI. And so a lot of things that we do, try to build a network and try to build up talent that could help do important work in this space. And so that, I think, benefits a lot from us being able to do the research and being one of the organizations that have been sort of thinking the longest and the hardest on some of these issues. And we try to be at the forefront of sort of what are going to be the big issues 2 years from now and whatnot. And then similarly, a lot of the way things have moved over the last 2 years is we try to think about a lot of our research from the perspective of, can we be helpful somehow to a policymaker or to a decision maker of some kind? And so we try to have that feedback signal, so to speak, go back from decision makers to the kinds of research questions that we try to rigorously answer. Mm-hmm. And then for all of that work, the key asset that we have, I think, is just that we have done a lot of this relevant research and thinking. Mm-hmm. At least if it's needed, quite often we'll have someone in the team who has thought a lot about a relevant question that a policymakers might have. And then that puts us in a better position to actually say something helpful.
And the reason I'm asking such nosy questions is that I think that a lot of people are looking at this now as a field where something has to change as opposed to merely be studied. You can't change it until you've studied it, but you also have to change it. And that change shows up in things like the EU AI Act. And so we've had people on here who are involved in the way that gets done and interpreted, and similar efforts, explaining what goes into that. And sometimes that looks like a sort of lobbying process. I mean, certainly anytime you're talking about regulation, lobbyists are all over the place. Would you call yourselves lobbyists in any form? That probably is more of an insult.
Yeah, I've been looking into these rules in details. Lobbying rules across the world are really quite different. In the EU, you need to register yourself as a quote-unquote lobbyist just for sort of having a conversation to someone in the commission, for example, so long as they're sort of senior enough about policy. So in that sense, we are lobbyists, but we don't see ourselves as an advocacy organization. For the most part, we see ourselves as an organization that first and foremost about research and about trying to answer hard and important questions. But then on top of that, obviously, the reason we're doing the research is, as you say, because we think that there's change needed, and we think that we hopefully can help push that change in more useful directions. But the sort of ideal that we try to aspire to, sort of when we engage with policymakers and whatnot, is that we are honest brokers. We're not there necessarily with a very, very clear agenda that we're really trying to push, but instead we're trying to help clarify issues and try to partly explain our point of view, but also just explain the issues well. And at least in my sense, or my view is that a lot of the times, sort of some of the most important policy actions and whatnot just kind of flow somewhat naturally from a certain view about where this technology is and where it might be heading.
And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for doing that, because that is such a valuable thing to do, to connect research to the process of making a difference in a way that is not bound to any transactional agenda. So thank you for doing that. There's not enough of that. Yes. Now, to talk about what it is that you're trying to do there, how much of a definitional problem is there? I mean, defining AI alone, I suspect that the conversations would be entirely different if John McCarthy had picked two different words for that back in 1956. And so the boundaries between machine learning and business intelligence or advanced statistics are famously blurry. But it does seem to be one of those things that everyone can agree there are areas, sort of like that justice of the Supreme Court saying, I may not be able to define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. We may not be able to define AGI, but we know it when we see it. Are we better at defining AGI and the things that you're concerned about than that? Or is it good enough to say we'll know it when we see it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one view that I have is less rides on these kinds of definitions than one might think. So if we just start with the easy case, so we're thinking about, okay, what even is AI? And then take a little bit of a cue from this paper that one of my colleagues, Jonas Schütt, wrote about defining AI for sort of regulation. And the claim that he makes there that I think is very plausible is, if you're designing a regulatory regime, the words AI, not a lot should be resting on that. But your main job is to cut down the scope, to sort of make the regime point at the right kinds of systems using other bits, using other things. And so in the AI Act, at least in my view, the words AI, people have often criticized them for just, the definition is just very, very broad for AI. My view is that's completely fine because we cut down the scope using other features. And so the way that we cut down the scope in the AI Act is we say, okay, well, if you're using one of these systems to make automated decisions about XYZ, then it's a high-risk system. And then all of these requirements fall into place. And the juicy bit where the really, really important work happens is this, how you define high-risk AI. And then if we're talking about in the AI Act, the other thing that they did was they started to introduce this concept of general-purpose AI systems. And then they introduced this concept of general-purpose AI systems with systemic risk. And so this is the EU term for systems such as ChatGPT and whatnot. And there, a lot of the work is being done by something entirely different. It's being done by this concept of floating point operations. So currently they're saying that at least systems that are trained using more than 10 to the 25 flop, i.e. it's sort of trained by using more computational power than the vast majority of AI systems that have ever been developed. To date, I think maybe there's 8 or something like this AI systems that have been trained with this amount of computational power. And that's the most of the work in the AI Act. That's how that is being defined, or sort of how you're sort of capturing the systems. And my guess is that that's the kind of approach that you'll often need to take. And then we'll always get back to a lot of these questions about, how do we define these various terms? But my hope is that we don't actually need to bottom out those discussions fully, and we can still make progress.
Understood. And you are making progress. And the Biden administration executive order specified 10 to the 26th operations and training, which was they're getting into a very specific number, as you've been talking about. Do you worry about the possibility that algorithms will be developed that completely void that benchmark?
Yeah, so for context, 10 to 26 flop, that is more compute than any existing model on the market has been trained with. It seems quite plausible to me that there are systems that are not released yet that meets this bar. And then the way that the EU or the executive order works is people or those developers of those systems, they need to notify the government ahead of time that they are developing such a system, and they need to sort of, before they deploy it, they need to give the government certain information about sort of testing about it and whatnot. And these flop thresholds, they are a tricky business. And I think that it is true that they might end up becoming a little bit, I guess there's a risk that they'll sort of become outdated over time. But it's a bit unclear to me actually which direction it goes. So one direction that you might think, which is what you was just pointing to. So, okay, well, algorithmic efficiency keeps going up. We keep getting better at figuring out how to take computational power, bits moving around in GPUs, in huge data centers, and turning that into an AI model that has all kinds of capabilities. And so that keeps increasing over time.
There was something fairly recently about a breakthrough in algorithms for matrix multiplication. I don't remember the numbers for that exactly, but that was the sort of thing that I had in mind when I was asking how much is it an issue if people come up with radically better algorithms that mean they can do alarming things in well under 10 to the 25th operations.
Yeah, so the algorithmic efficiency, it seems like studies suggest that it's sort of increasing or sort of, I guess, being halved. You're able to get the same performance for half the amount of computational power roughly every 8 months or so. Is the sort of best study that we have on this gives that number. Although that being said, that paper gives a 95% confidence interval of 5 to 14 months. And so there's a decent amount of uncertainty on this. But yes, so this means that sort of over time, you'll be able to do what you previously needed 10 to the 26 to do. A year later, you'll be able to do it with half that amount of computational power. And I think this is going to be a challenge. Maybe this means that you need to keep moving down the threshold, although that will come with this problem with, now I'm covering significantly more systems than I previously did. And people might get sort of upset about that because they don't want their activities to be regulated. And then it might also be the case that things go the other way around. And so it seems quite plausible to me that at any point in time, it will be the case that the highest compute system are the systems that are going to have the highest capabilities. And so will sort of therefore be the ones that potentially have the highest risk. And another thought that you might have is that if you set these thresholds right, actually, you'll maybe want to move them up over time. And so one reason you might think that is the main reason, at least in my mind, for example, in the US, they set this 10 to 26 threshold. The main reason they did that was because you have this belief that, okay, well, our current systems, they're somewhat risky and they're a little bit concerning, but they're not that concerning. Maybe you might think that they're not concerning enough to intervene as a regulator. I don't know if I think that that's true, but I think there's a decent case to be made that that's the case. And so if that's the case, then the reason that you set this threshold is because we don't know what the future systems are able to do. And so in that case, sort of more because when you get to 10 to 26, there's sort of a fog of war there that you don't have a sense of. And you set this threshold, and when you set the threshold, what the threshold is doing is it's telling companies and whatnot to just companies and regulators to pay more attention to these particular systems, do more testing, see what they can do, understand their impacts, try to reduce those impacts as much as you can. And so if that's the case, then you could imagine that the threshold should be moved up over time. And then maybe another reason that it might need to be moved up over time is just that as these systems diffuse into the economy, society might be able to adapt more and more to dealing with their impacts and whatnot. But yeah, overall, my view is it's really quite unclear what you'll need to do with these thresholds. And if you set them, especially if you set them for a regulator, it's just very, very important that you are ready to change them over time, and also that you're ready to complement them with other things. And so my guess is that over time, maybe it might be the case that we learn enough about how AI works to be able to say, well, if a model was trained using this particular architecture or trained in this particular way, or maybe someone trained it using reinforcement learning while it was just roaming around in the world and trying to do a very particular task, you might think that that kind of system you're actually a little bit more worried about because it has had more sort of free parameters and the kinds of behaviors that it might learn. And so there could be those kinds of factors that might also shift what kinds of thresholds you should set. Maybe that's a thing that you'll sort of have to complement with. The EU AI Act also does an interesting thing here where actually in the Act it says it gives this sort of ability to exclude certain models from the scope if it's the case that it hits the sort of compute threshold, but you test it for its capabilities in some kind of way. And if those capabilities are non-concerning enough, then it might be excluded. Currently, I don't think we know how to do those tests, but maybe in the future, it would be possible to design tests are such that you could get sufficient confidence that, okay, this system is nothing to sort of pay too much attention to.
I'm thinking about verification. When we're talking about regulation, we're talking about asking people to do things that they wouldn't do unless they were told. And so there's got to be some reluctance there to do that is offset by not wanting to get caught doing that thing. But if you can't verify that they're not doing that thing, it seems pointless. And we were talking about levels of compute here, which are relatively rare, so that you could probably put pins on a map of the world and into the places that are capable of doing that and not run out of pins. But that level of compute has other uses, climate modeling, making CGI movies that are not regulated. And so how close do you have to be to the point of software implementation to tell what is happening? Okay, there's a lot of thoughts I have here around what are the verification mechanisms that lead in all kinds of fantastic directions. I have no idea that they are realistic, but let's start talking about the general concept of verification.
Yeah, those are some really, really excellent questions. Maybe one thing to note is currently there's nothing to verify. Currently, there are no requirements other than those requirements that I described in the executive order that are currently placed on sort of the developers of these most powerful systems. The EU AI Act has been passed, but it's not yet in force. And the UK has sort of recently announced that some kind of regulation of these sort of most powerful systems will sort of be proposed, ideally, probably sometime this year, sort of late in the year. Currently, there are no requirements imposed to verify. But once we have those requirements, what do we do? One big challenge is this challenge that you were pointing to of sort of how do you identify the entities or the models or the actors that some kind of requirements would be imposed on. That's one challenge. And then the next challenge is, okay, well, assuming that we know who our players are, we know what the relevant actors are they doing what they're supposed to do? Maybe we can start with the first thing. Currently, one thing that you can get pretty far with is, and this is how I expect a lot of the sort of regulation and whatnot to be put in place, at least initially, is you just focus on organizations that are offering or otherwise making available their models to the world. And so you might say, okay, well, if you are selling a system to someone in our jurisdiction, then you got to follow these rules. And so how do I find them? Well, they're making lots of sales in your jurisdiction. And so at least the big actors, you'll have some means to find them. And at least currently, at least if you focus on sort of the very most powerful systems, it is not a large group of players. If you look at sort of the companies that are really sort of at the frontier here, I think, maybe you would say 4, 5, 6 companies or so. And even within that, there's a bit of gradation. But over time, you might have more challenges, right? And so over time, if you have these sort of algorithmic deficiencies and whatnot, and then maybe it turns out that you're worried about systems that are 10 to the 25, maybe you're worried that those systems pose some significant risk. I don't know if that will be the case, but that could well be the case. If that's the case and you want to find all of those actors, then you have a much harder challenge, especially if that number really, really keeps going up. It seems plausible to me that will go up a decent amount over time. And it will be much cheaper to sort of become one of those actors. What do you do there? It becomes more difficult. An additional thing you can do is sort of what you were pointing to. So you could try to look into the compute supply chain. So myself and some co-authors, we've been thinking about how compute, or sort of the underlying chips and hardware that is being used to run these computations, could be used as sort of a potential lever for governance. And so at a base level, you could end up doing things like, okay, well, so currently there's a pretty small number of companies that are really offering these kinds of services, especially that are sort of easy to get a handle on. So the sort of biggest cloud companies, there's about 3 of them. In the AI space, I would expect that they have a really quite big chunk of the market, higher than 50%. And so one thing that you could do is you could say, okay, well, these actors, they need to, first of all, do some kind of KYC. So similar to what banks do. So if I'm trying to open up a bank account, and maybe if I'm trying to do a particularly big transaction that looks worrying in some kind of way, they need to know who I am, and they need to have certain information on me. And you could imagine that you would introduce something like that for sufficiently large amounts of computational power. This might be something also that, especially in the US, that folks might be interested in doing for sort of national security reasons as well. So the US has put in place all of these export controls on chips, but they don't have export controls on computational cloud computing. So people accessing those chips remotely. And you could imagine that's a next step that one might be interested in there is make sure that it's more difficult for the PLA to buy cloud computing from Google and whatnot. I don't expect that a lot of that is being done, but maybe some of it is being done, and at least maybe you want to know whether it's happening. And so this could be one route by which you might be able to sort of identify more of these systems. And so you might say, okay, any actor that has sort of enough compute to train a model that is above the threshold that we put for our regulation, the cloud compute provider at least should, number one, maybe they ask the regulator, does this person are they allowed to do this kind of training? Maybe you could have a step before then where you check, does it seem like they are doing training? Maybe you just ask them. Maybe you can also find certain signals sort of in how the computation is being used. So for example, if you're running a model, then probably you'll have a lot of communication with the outside world, like with the internet, because you're serving this model to customers. But if you're just training it, usually what you do is you take the data, you put it on some big hardware stacks of memory in the data center itself. And that sends in the data that the model is being trained on. And so maybe there's signals like that you could look out for, make this a little bit less invasive. But yeah, I think there's ideas like this. And maybe you could also move even one layer down where you look at what even are the places in the world where there are data centers that have sufficient computational power to be able to train these systems in some reasonable amount of time. And currently, at least if you look at the high flop thresholds, there's just not that many. That might be another thing that might help you here. So that was a lot on the first one.
Yes, it's really interesting there to bring up the analogy with financial transactions, because usually the go-to analogy is with nuclear weapon production, which I'll get to. But I think that one of the main reasons that banks impose that kind of governance on big transactions is that if they don't report those to the IRS, the United States will deny them the right to negotiate in the US dollar as a reserve currency, which would stop any international bank from functioning. And so they make laws like FATCA that govern how United States citizens have to report their financial status. But
that's why we all over the world, in Sweden and the UK, we have to answer whether we are US citizens or not when we're opening bank accounts, which feels like
I'm very I'm very well aware of that. And so that suggests what would analogous mechanisms be here, acknowledging that we're moving in a direction of classifying data centers in the same category as munitions eventually. That's the end of the first half of the interview. We'll do the next half next week for the usual reasons of giving everyone's attention span a bit of a break. I know there are podcasts that run 2 or more hours per episode, Lex Fridman, but our philosophy is a bit more conservative. Plus, we release every Monday like clockwork. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, this is a fun one. The Japanese company SoftBank has developed AI voice-altering technology for call centers that will tone down angry emotions in the voices of callers. They call this emotion cancelling, and the aim is to relieve stress experienced by call center operators being yelled at by frustrated customers. Their press release said, quote, "We are working on the development of a solution that can convert the customer's voice into a calm, conversational tone and deliver it to our workers using AI-enabled emotion recognition and voice processing technology." End quote. It was prompted by a television program highlighting the verbal abuse call center staff often endure. Toshiyuki Nakatani, a SoftBank employee, was inspired to create a solution to protect others from such harassment. It currently works only in Japanese. However, the company is currently exploring the possibility of extending the technology to other languages. But the technology for this is by now fairly routine. The more important and more obvious questions are around this editing of human emotions. Did it maybe occur to any of the companies using this that their customers' anger was feedback for them? That something they were doing wasn't working? Any organization that goes to such obvious lengths to ignore how its customers feel about it has a major disconnect going on, and using AI in this way is only going to make that worse. It just triggers one of my pet peeves. Warning, rant coming. Why do so many places now sport signs saying that abuse towards their staff will not be tolerated? Banks, supermarkets, airports, government offices, you name it. Let's unpack this a bit. The sort of abuse they're talking about is, of course, people getting mad at customer service agents, like the car rental agent who tells them that there's no car for them despite having a confirmed reservation. This is such a common occurrence that it turned into a bit on a Seinfeld episode. 20 years ago, signs like that were rare. So there are 2 possible reasons for their proliferation. Either there's more abuse going on, or businesses are less tolerant of it than they used to be. I can't evaluate the latter, but it seems unlikely. But there's ample reason in my mind to believe that there's more abuse, in quotes, going on. Let's unpack that a bit more. One reflexive response would be to say that people are just more rude and nasty than they used to be. Now, there's plenty of evidence of that, much of it captured on videos all over the internet, but I don't think it's the only thing going on, and that's why I put abuse in quotes, because I think much of that behavior is more appropriately termed customer dissatisfaction. So many businesses have retreated behind a wall they disingenuously call customer service, which is in fact designed to provide the cheapest appearance of customer focus while avoiding providing real service. I hardly need to give examples because these are universal experiences that anyone with a pulse can relate to. Lines that form hours before workplaces open, telephone response systems that take you in loops without ever connecting you to a human being or put you on hold the whole day trying, automated handling of your complaint in ways that cannot be appealed, and let's not forget overbooked flights. Certainly, I think those companies would like to provide better customer service, but they're just engaged in a race to the bottom in competition with everyone else and can't see their way clear to marketing a product or service that costs 30% more than everyone else's, but you get better help when you need it. So, many cases of what these signs are talking about have been, in my experience, the customer cracking under the strain of the abuse heaped upon them by the business, which has placed them in a situation where the only representatives of that company they come in contact with are ones that A, didn't cause that abuse, and B, have been given little to no authority to do anything about it. But when you get the inevitable customer satisfaction survey afterwards, every question is oriented around how that hapless representative conducted themselves, and you know that your response is going to be used to partly determine whether they keep their job. Whereas not one question on the survey is about whether or how the company's systems, policies, or management caused your problem in the first place. Do you think that a customer service culture like that, spread across Western civilization, might cause some friction that those spineless companies are only too happy to frame as being the product of society's degenerates? And one of the workplaces you do not see one of those signs is on an individual's cubicle at, insert name of megacorporation here. Their bosses may subject them to abuse and stress all day long without fear of being called to account. If those same individuals also have customer-facing roles where they face that accounting, well, you can imagine their stress rising to the point that maybe they're the next person to crack when they're told their flight is cancelled due to staff shortages. Okay, well, I did tell you there was a rant coming. Guess it was time to let it out. And because AI amplifies a company's existing culture, it makes the situation worse in places. As anyone who's received an incorrect Facebook copyright violation claim knows. Next week, we will conclude the interview with Markus Anderljung, when we'll talk about verification processes, ingenious schemes to verify hardware platforms, the frontier AI safety commitments, and who should set safety standards for the industry. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.